So let's just have a deeper look at this process of sorting the neurological wheat from the psychiatrical chaff. And the way that I'm going to do this is by having a look at the Napoleon of neuroses, who was working in the Salpetriere. The Salpetriere, which was where the majority of insane women were kept in France from about the 17th century onwards. The Salpetriere, where some might say there was a kind of symbolic symmetry in the fact that it was the hospital that had been dedicated to hysteria, but where Princess Diana died after her car accident. Different forms of hysteria colliding many years after each other. And we know the Salpetriere being one of the principal places where a lot of the moral therapy ideas have been developed during the early 19th century, because it's here that Pinel and Esquirol cut their teeth. The most important era for the development of neurology was the era of Charcot. There's a picture of some of the inmates of the Salpetriere in their garden, representing different types of mental condition. Charcot was at the Salpetriere from 1860 to 1893, and he was the neurologist. He was the man that, in a way, laid down the foundations of this particular science. He was an extraordinary man. There he is. I got my animation slightly out of whack there. That's the photograph that he gave to Sigmund Freud, who spent a few months working under Charcot at the Salpetriere, and it was a bit of an acolyte of Charcot as well. So he gave him the look at the photograph. He really is taking that notion of being the Napoleon of neuroses pretty damn seriously. You know? He's thought about this. You know, he's got this photograph to give away to people, and he's thought about how shall I be posed. That's the classic Napoleon pose, you know, the hands slightly within the coat. There are many conditions named after him because he identified them quite brilliantly. He brilliantly delineated multiple sclerosis, for example, using pathological anatomy. Before that time, they weren't quite sure what it was. They thought it was a form of Parkinson's, and they thought that Parkinson's itself was something that fell within the remit of the psychiatric conditions, not the nervous conditions. But he was able to delineate the two of them and separate one from the other. My nice illustration there has gone. I'm sorry about that. I might put that to rights if I remember. There was a beautiful picture drawn in 1838 by James Carswell that clearly shows multiple sclerosis, but he wasn't able to identify it as multiple sclerosis. You could find these grey patches, these lesions on the spinal cord, randomly scattered around different areas. The sclerosis is the lesion, the kind of grey lesion, and the multiple gives you the sense of how random it was around the system. And what he's done is he's done that typical thing of comparing symptoms before death. He's done the post-mortem after death, identified the lesions, and he's seen enough of it and can say, yeah, that's a condition, separate condition on its own, multiple sclerosis, and it's a condition of the nervous system. And it's able to use this technique to identify many of the major conditions during this time, including Tourette's, which is probably one of my favourite neurological conditions, if you can indeed have a favourite neurological one. Tourette's would be it. And more than that, he became the ringmaster of hysteria. And we're going to explore this in far more detail in the lectures on gender. But Charcot was convinced that hysteria, a disease that seemed to affect women more than men, although he also believed that men could be affected with it as well, a disease that produced various kinds of tics and strange movements and strange utterances, strange poses that seemingly there was no reason why people would suddenly start. And think of Keira Knightley at the beginning of A Dangerous Method. Like that. She's gone in hysterical mode. I bet you wish you were at the lecture now. People are laughing. I'm trying to do my sort of Keira Knightley hysteria thing. I'm not sure it's working. But he, along with other people, was absolutely convinced that hysteria was the product of a damaged nervous system or a diseased nervous system. And he was determined to identify that. And he had a coterie of women, his little coterie of women, who he used to get to perform every Tuesday. And people would come from all over France, all over Europe, even from the US, to witness what was going on in his Tuesday sessions. Basically, what he would do was use hypnosis to put these women into a trance state, and then they would go through their neurotic kind of paces, which you can see there. That's Augustine. And again, I'll talk about Augustine in more detail when we talk about hysteria. He's absolutely convinced that it is a nervous condition rather than a mental condition. He's never able to find a single lesion to prove it. The other thing that and yet that seems to reinforce his belief. He's just got to look harder. He still thinks that it's, at the end of his life, he still thinks that it's a neurological condition. It has, of course, a rather nasty twist, this neurological condition. Our man is convinced that this particular neurological disease, hysteria, is the product of a degenerative nervous system. In other words, if you were a hysteric, you were a degenerate. Remember from the last lecture, those people that were a danger to the race because they were running evolution in reverse, the degeneracy theory. And he believed that if you could be hypnotized, you were a hysteric, and if you were a hysteric, you were showing signs of racial degeneracy. We will talk about that in more detail, as I said. What follows is a short session discussing Elaine Showalter's view of madness and gender. Showalter is probably the preeminent feminist historian of madness and someone that I think that everybody should read. There are problems with some of her ideas which I can't actually deal with in this lecture. But here what I do is start charting out the different periodization that she develops to explore madness before then revisiting the Salpetriere and what Charcot is doing in his salon. She has, as I've already indicated, a very clear periodization of how women fit into madness. Moral therapy in the asylum, what I've just talked about, Darwinism, where degeneration spills over into the idea that it might be affecting women's nervous systems in such a way that they become hysterical. Think Charcot's hysterical women, who we will revisit in the next slide. She goes all the way through to the current era, the modernistic era, where the female schizophrenic is the person that she holds up as the image of madness. And she's thinking in particular of the kind of work that we're going to see done by people like R.D. Laing during the late 50s and early 60s. Laing himself sets up a therapeutic community, and you couldn't get into the therapeutic community on the whole if you were a man. You're far more likely to get in there if you were a woman. And if you could have an affair with one of the psychiatrists, that was all well and good as well. So that's what she's thinking about in terms of the modern era. But for now, I think that it's worth recapping what went on at the Salpetriere under the auspices of Jean-Marie Charcot. who held these incredible afternoon sessions and soirees where he would display his hysteric women to the world. Now, remember that he is a degenerationist. He believes that hysteria is a product of a nervous system gone wrong. He believes that at some point he's going to be able to identify the lesions in the nervous system. And he also believes that a sign, a symptom, a clear-cut symptom of a hysteric was the ability to be hypnotised. So if you could be hypnotised, then you were a hysteric. And of course, as we know, he also believed in male hysteria, which we'll talk about a bit later on. It has to be said, however, that Showalter focuses upon the female hysteria and almost totally excludes the male hysteria from the picture. This is partly because what made these lectures and soirees so celebrated was the display of the women. You know, again, look at this image. You know, no women in the audience there. None of these medical men that have come to see Charcot put on his show. None of them are women. They're all sitting there astounded, extraordinary, incredible. There he is in control, the Napoleon of neuroses, looking like Napoleon all the time, presenting himself like the great man. In control, he's hypnotised the woman. She's thrown herself back passively. Again, a very sexual image, helpless in the arms of Charcot's attendants. No, Freud would have fulfilled that role. We do see a nurse there on the side as well. There is a nurse to minister to whichever one of the hysterics that is. But again, man in control, woman passive, sexualized, powerless in the face of 1870s, 1880s neurology. Now, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, that when we talked about Charcot, he used a lot of photography to demonstrate the kind of hysterias that he was identifying through this process of hypnosis. And it was kind of like cutting-edge technology. You know, this is the fMRI of its day. These are the images that will circulate around Europe and the world, projecting forms of hysteria. And at the same time, they're highly staged, highly posed, and again, highly sexualized. That is, I think, his, and you'll recognise the image because it's been used a few times before. That was one of his star hysterics, one of the stars of the show. That was Augustine, who is undergoing this bêlement hystérique. The bêlement is kind of when you take a deep breath in, like that, and let it out. But he's suggesting that this form of hysteria replicates that. No doubt he made the connections between the way that respiration and expiration were also connected to the nervous system. But here we see the woman out of control. And then there was I can't remember, I think that's Blanche, the sexually abused Blanche, going through her poses, her hysterical poses that often seem to be both religious but also ecstatic. And I don't think, you know, you really would be hard pressed to again miss the sexualization going on here and all of the discourses that surround it, both of passivity, irrationality, sexuality, and madness itself. Nevertheless, as persuasive, or no, I think persuasive is the wrong word, as suggestive, as interesting as Showalter's thesis is, it does have some significant problems that have been pointed out by a number of historians.